There's a specific moment in the arc of dynamics with an avoidant that most people never reach, not because it's hidden or rare, but because getting there requires something that runs so contrary to the way anxious attachment works that it feels, from the inside, almost like giving up. It isn't, but it feels like it. That moment is the moment you stop treating the connection like a question that needs answering. The moment you stop checking, hoping, monitoring, interpreting. The moment you redirect all of that energy, all of it, back toward your own life, your own growth, your own future, as if the avoidant is simply no longer a variable in the equation. When that happens, not as a strategy, not as a performance, but as a genuine internal shift, something changes in the dynamic, sometimes dramatically, sometimes in ways that feel almost inexplicable to the person who experiences it. The avoidant who had gone cold begins to reach back. The one who had disappeared begins to reappear. The one who seemed fully disengaged begins to pay attention in ways they weren't before. The person who had been moving through your orbit with indifference becomes suddenly, urgently aware of your absence. Why? That's what this video is about, and the answer is rooted in attachment psychology, specifically in what happens inside an avoidance system when the one source of relational pressure that was activating their withdrawal simply stops being present. Today, we're going to build the full picture. We're going to look at the neuroscience and attachment theory behind this effect, at what the avoidant actually experiences during this phase, at what genuine disengagement requires from the other person, and why it's profoundly difficult to achieve, and at what happens when the avoidant reaches back, and what determines whether that reconnection leads anywhere lasting. We're also going to look at the common mistakes that undo the progress, at the difference between performed and genuine disengagement, and at what all of this ultimately points toward in terms of your own work. Let's start at the foundation. Understanding what genuine disengagement does to an avoidance system. When we talk about treating an avoidant like they're gone, when we describe the psychological posture of genuine disengagement, we're not talking about cruelty. We're not talking about punishment. We're not talking about performing indifference in a way designed to create hurt or manufacture urgency. The phrase is evocative, but what it actually describes is a very specific internal shift. The moment a person stops organizing their emotional life around someone who is not showing up for them. To understand why this affects an avoidant so specifically, you need to understand what role the other person's continued engagement has been playing in the avoidance system during the withdrawal period. The avoidant, during any period of withdrawal, is not emotionally neutral. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about this attachment style. The idea that when an avoidant goes cold or distant, they've switched off and feel nothing. What the research actually shows is different and worth understanding carefully. During withdrawal periods, avoidants are using significant cognitive and emotional energy to maintain the suppression of attachment-related material. The deactivating strategies, the focus on the partner's flaws, the mental rehearsal of independence, the deployment of logic in place of feeling, the cognitive minimizing of the relationship's importance, these are active processes. They require ongoing effort. They are not a state of rest. They are, in their own way, a form of constant management. Philip Shaver and Mario Mikulinka's research, using both self-report and neuroimaging measures, has shown that avoidants, when they encounter attachment-related stimuli that they haven't been able to fully suppress, show elevated activation in the regions of the brain associated with threat processing. The calm exterior is real. Their behavioral suppression is effective, but the underlying physiological activity tells a different story. The system is working hard to maintain the appearance of indifference. And here's the key insight that changes everything. The continued presence of the other person's pursuit actively facilitates that suppression. It provides fresh material to push against. The emotional demand, the reaching, the visible need, all of it continuously activates the avoidance. It provides the very stimulus that justifies the distance. The avoidance system registers. This is why closeness is dangerous. This is exactly the kind of emotional intensity the strategy was designed to manage. And the suppression continues, reinforced by each new cycle of the other person reaching and the avoidant pulling further back. When the other person stops pursuing, genuinely stops, not as a tactic, but as a real change in internal orientation, the avoidant loses that stimulus. And something important happens in its absence. The suppression, which was calibrated to manage incoming emotional demand, suddenly has nothing active to manage. The system was braced for an impact that doesn't come. And in that unexpected space, the underlying attachment material, the feelings that were always there, that were being managed rather than eliminated, begins to surface. This is the beginning of what people observe as the avoidant waking up. It is a real neurological and psychological phenomenon. Understanding why it happens at that level separates this from wishful thinking and grounds it in the actual mechanics of how attachment systems work under stress and in the absence of their usual triggers. The time frame in which this shift becomes observable varies considerably. Some avoidants begin to notice the effects of genuine absence within weeks, particularly fearful avoidant individuals whose anxious component creates a faster processing time for perceived loss. Others, especially thoroughgoing dismissive avoidants with highly efficient deactivating strategies, may not register the shift consciously for months. This variability is one of the reasons why genuine disengagement is difficult to sustain. People often give up, feeling certain that nothing is happening, precisely at the moment before something would have become visible. There is no way to know the specific timeline for any particular avoidant. What we know is that the mechanism exists, that it is reliable, and that it operates on the avoidance system at whatever pace that particular system requires. There's also a social context component worth noting. Avoidants are often more affected by the perception of genuine disengagement through social proximity, mutual friends, shared spaces, overlapping circles, than they are by direct communication or its absence. An avoidant who hears from a mutual friend that the other person seems genuinely happy and invested in their life, that they've started something new, that they're clearly not waiting. That second-hand evidence can accelerate the internal process that genuine disengagement initiates, not because of jealousy specifically, but because it constitutes additional evidence that the absence is real, that the other person genuinely has somewhere else to be. The avoidance system reads that evidence in the same way it reads the behavioral evidence of disengagement, as confirmation that the emotional demand they were managing is no longer present. And in the absence of that demand, the attachment that was being suppressed has increasing difficulty staying suppressed. The logic of delayed processing. Why the avoidant feels it. Later, attachment theory describes what Bowlby called the protest-despair sequence, a predictable pattern in response to perceived separation from an attachment figure. In anxiously attached individuals, this sequence runs fast and hot. The protest phase is immediate, intense, and consuming. The distress is visible, the pursuit is activated. The system makes its alarm obvious in ways that are difficult to miss. In avoidance, the sequence is completely different. They suppress the protest response so effectively that often neither they nor the people around them recognize it for what it is. The process of potential loss is slower, more delayed, more muted at the surface. This delay is not indifference. It's the specific signature of a system that learned very early that protesting loss wasn't safe, that reaching for someone who wasn't coming back only added more pain to the original wound, and so it learned not to reach, at least not visibly. at least not immediately. What this means practically is that an avoidant who has withdrawn from a relationship often doesn't consciously register what has been lost until the other person actually stops being available. While the person is still there, still reachable, still sending signals of care and desire for reconnection, the avoidance system maintains the comfortable position of withdrawal. The connection is available on demand if they want it. They simply don't want it right now. The suppression holds that position with minimal disruption. But when the other person genuinely disengages, when they stop responding with the warmth and availability that was always there, the dynamic changes in a way the avoidance system must actually register. The connection is no longer available on demand. The thing they were confident would be waiting when they decided to turn back around is no longer clearly there. This is the moment that activates what researchers call hyperactivation, the sudden emergence of attachment anxiety that the deactivating strategies were specifically designed to prevent. The avoidant begins to think about the person with more frequency, to notice their absence in a way that isn't easily rationalized away, to mentally revisit the connection and find that the mental image carries more positive valence than the deactivating strategies were allowing. The suppressed positive feelings, the genuine care, the admiration, the experiences that made the connection valuable in the first place, begin to surface through the gap left by the deactivating material the system no longer needs to deploy at full intensity. This is why genuine disengagement affects avoidance in a way that continued pursuit never does. Pursuit keeps the deactivation active by providing ongoing justification for it. Absence dissolves the justification. And in the dissolved state, what was always underneath has nowhere to hide and no active mechanism suppressing it. One critical clarification. This dynamic does not affect every avoidant the same way, and it does not affect every relationship the same way. An avoidant who had already fully processed out of the connection before the other person's withdrawal, who had mentally exited the relationship before anything changed behaviorally, will not necessarily respond with renewed interest. The activation of attachment that genuine absence produces depends on whether there was genuine, substantial attachment to begin with. If the avoidant had strong, positive feelings that they were suppressing, genuine disengagement removes the suppression trigger and those feelings surface. If they had already moved on, there isn't much to resurface. Understanding honestly which situation you're actually in is part of the self-assessment that this territory requires. It's also worth distinguishing between different subtypes of avoidant attachment because they respond to absence somewhat differently. Dismissive, avoidant individuals, those who have the most thoroughgoing suppression of attachment needs, who most strongly identify with independence and self-sufficiency, tend to have the most delayed response to genuine disengagement. Their deactivating system is robust and well practiced, and they're less likely to consciously recognize what the absence is producing in them until it's been sustained for a meaningful period of time. Fearful avoidant individuals, who carry both avoidant and anxious elements, who want closeness and fear it simultaneously, tend to respond more quickly to genuine absence because their anxious component is already primed to register loss. They may reach back sooner, but the reconnection requires careful management because the fearful avoidance approach, avoidance conflict, will reassert itself when closeness increases again. Neither pattern is better or worse, but understanding which you're dealing with changes the timeline and the specific calibrations required for navigating what follows. There is a third element worth acknowledging: the avoidant's current life circumstances. An avoidant who is in a period of high stress, professional difficulty, family upheaval, a significant transition, may not have the bandwidth to process what genuine absence is doing to their attachment system, even when something is clearly shifting. Their deactivating resources are occupied elsewhere. The timing of genuine disengagement matters, not in a way that should make you time it strategically. You can't and shouldn't, but in a way that explains why the same dynamic can produce dramatically different responses at different points in two people's lives. The mechanism is consistent. The conditions in which it operates vary. What the avoidant experiences during this phase. It's worth taking real time to describe what this actually feels like from inside the avoidance experience, because understanding it changes how you interpret what you see when the shift begins. During their own withdrawal, the avoidant is not in distress. Their system is doing what it was designed to do, managing the perceived threat of closeness by creating distance from it. There may be mild guilt, a low-level awareness that what's happening isn't entirely fair, and occasional flickers of warmth for the other person that surface briefly before being rationalized away. But the dominant experience is of regulation, of having restored a sense of autonomy and space after what felt like too much intimacy. Relative to the internal tension of sustained closeness, withdrawal feels like relief, like breathing again after a period of held breath. When the other person begins to genuinely disengage, the first shift in the avoidant is typically subtle enough to dismiss. It might feel like mild curiosity about what the person is doing. A small uptick in awareness of the absence where there was always presence. An impulse to check in that surfaces, gets noticed, and then gets rationalized. They're probably busy. I'll reach out when I feel like it. There's no urgency. Everything is fine. But if the disengagement deepens and persists, if the other person is genuinely redirecting their life in a way that becomes observable, the rationalizations start to work less efficiently. The impulses to reach out become more frequent and less easily dismissed. The thoughts about the person become harder to root around. A quality of restlessness enters the system that the usual deactivating strategies don't fully resolve. The avoidant may experience this as being vaguely unsettled without being able to identify why, as finding themselves thinking about someone more than they'd have expected, as noticing a flatness in interactions with other people that wasn't present before, as returning in memory to specific moments in the relationship with a different quality of feeling than the deactivating narrative had assigned to them. This is the phase that, witnessed from outside, looks like the avoidant having a change of heart. And, in a real sense, it is. But it's important to understand exactly what's happening. The avoidance attachment system is finally doing the processing that the deactivating strategies were delaying. The feelings that were always there, that were never eliminated, only managed, are surfacing in the absence of the usual suppression triggers. What the avoidant then does with that processing is their own work. They may reach back, they may not. They may reach back and then withdraw again when the anxiety of closeness reasserts itself, as it often does before a person has genuinely changed their pattern. The surfacing of feeling is the beginning of a process, not the resolution of one. It's also worth noting that this internal shift is not comfortable for the avoidant. There's a common misconception that when an avoidant begins to feel the effects of genuine absence, they experience something simple and clean, like regret or longing. The actual experience is more complicated. Along with the longing, which is real, there's a disorientation. The identity narrative that tells the avoidant they don't need people, that they prefer independence, that closeness costs more than it's worth. That narrative has been providing stable ground for however long the withdrawal has lasted. The surfacing of genuine attachment feelings doesn't just produce longing, it produces a kind of internal friction with the avoidant's established self-concept. They may feel confused, they may feel irritated, which is often a cover for feeling vulnerable. They may oscillate between genuine desire to reconnect and the pull of the familiar avoidant position, sometimes multiple times in the same day. Understanding that the avoidance waking up is not a simple or comfortable experience helps calibrate expectations about what their re-engagement will look like if it happens. It may not look like clarity and confidence. It may look like tentative, inconsistent signals, a brief reach followed by a retreat, an expression of care followed by deflection. This inconsistency is not evidence that the feeling isn't real. It's evidence that the feeling is encountering the same system that was suppressing it, and that the two are in genuine tension. How that tension resolves depends on the avoidant's own willingness to do their work. Your role is not to resolve it for them. Your role is to respond to genuine movement toward you with the same self-possession and warmth that made the movement possible in the first place. The crucial difference between performed and genuine disengagement. Here's the distinction that separates this topic from game playing, and why that distinction matters more than most people who read about this understand. Performed disengagement is when someone decides to go quiet strategically, to withdraw their availability as a deliberate tactic designed to create anxious longing in the avoidant and pull them back. This is a recognizable internet advice pattern. Mirror their energy, match their distance, make them miss you. And it fails consistently with avoidance, specifically because of what their system evolved to detect. Avoidance grew up in environments where the emotional atmosphere frequently didn't match what was being said or shown on the surface. A parent who was physically present but emotionally absent. Care that was offered with conditions that weren't stated directly. Emotional messages that contradicted the verbal ones. Because of this, avoidance developed an unusually high calibration for reading beneath the surface of behavior. They're not consciously doing this. It's automatic. The same way anyone who grew up reading subtext for safety develops the skill without choosing to. What this means for performed disengagement is that the avoidance system will often detect the performance even when the performer believes they're being convincing. They'll sense the anxiety underneath the silence. They'll register the emotional preoccupation that the behavioral withdrawal is trying to disguise. And what they'll read is not, this person has genuinely moved on. What they'll read is, this person is doing a version of the same thing from a different angle. The strategy changes. The underlying energy doesn't. And avoidants tend to exit from strategic games rather than be moved by them, because strategy reads as exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that their system learned early to protect against. Genuine disengagement has a completely different quality. It's not quiet. Often, the person is very active. They're engaged with their life. They're investing in their projects and friendships and development with real energy. The absence of the avoidant as a focus of their attention is not a calculated gap, but a natural result of genuine reorientation. The person isn't performing distance. They're actually somewhere else. And that distinction, felt at the level of energy rather than read through behavior, is what the avoidance finely calibrated system registers as real, which is what creates the actual shift. What genuine disengagement requires from you, and why it's so hard. Here's where this topic becomes genuinely demanding. The concept is straightforward to understand and profoundly difficult to actually execute, not because it's technically complex, but because it runs directly against the current of how anxious attachment responds to perceived loss. If you formed an anxious attachment in early life, the experience of a significant person withdrawing from you activates an ancient, powerful alarm. The attachment system reads the withdrawal as threat, not metaphorically, but in terms of actual physiological activation. Cortisol rises. The amygdala engages at a level that reduces access to prefrontal cortical processing, the part of the brain responsible for rational assessment and long-term perspective. The urgency you feel when an avoidant goes cold is not irrational, or pathetic, or weak. It is your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Mobilizing everything available to re-establish connection with someone, it is classified as an attachment figure whose proximity is necessary for survival. Operating against that mobilization, genuinely redirecting your attention, genuinely investing in your own life, genuinely ceasing the monitoring and hoping and checking that the alarm demands, requires working at a level deeper than behavior. You can stop sending messages. You can make yourself unavailable. You can perform disengagement with complete behavioral consistency. But if internally you are still completely organized around the avoidant, if your emotional life is primarily structured by whether they've reached out today, whether that post was meant for you, whether this silence signals the final end or another temporary phase, then you haven't actually disengaged. You've performed disengagement while remaining as anxiously attached and as emotionally preoccupied as ever. And as we've established, the avoidant will read that. Not always consciously, not through any psychic ability, but through the accumulated rate of signals that don't quite cohere with the behavioral withdrawal, the response latency that's a bit too calibrated, the social media activity that's a bit too clearly curated, the warmth when they do reach out that carries the charged quality of someone who has been waiting rather than someone who is genuinely elsewhere. Genuine disengagement requires a reorientation at the level of priorities and self-concept. A decision, not as strategy, not as a tactic for winning a dynamic, but as an act of self-respect, that your life is worth living fully, regardless of what this person does or doesn't do, that you are not going to hold your own development hostage to someone else's readiness, that the energy you've been directing toward the avoidant belongs, by right, to your own projects, your own relationships, your own unfolding as a person. This is not easy. For someone whose system has been activated by an avoidant, the genuine version of this requires confronting the anxiety directly, rather than managing it through pursuit. It requires sitting with the discomfort of not knowing where things stand, and sitting with it not by suppressing the discomfort, but by having enough genuine life happening that the uncertainty, while present, is not the only thing in the room. This is, in practical terms, about having somewhere real to go when the anxiety rises, not a distraction, not an escape, a life, something you're building that matters to you, regardless of any single relationship's outcome. The nervous system component of this work is important to understand in some detail, because without it, the effort tends to become purely cognitive, a kind of willpower-based forcing of non-pursuit that doesn't address the underlying alarm. The anxious attachment alarm is stored in the body. It lives in the nervous system's threat detection architecture, which evolved long before the cerebral cortex developed the capacity for the kind of reasoning that tells you you're going to be okay. You cannot think your way past the alarm. You have to work at the level of the body. This means, in practical terms, developing somatic awareness, the ability to notice where the anxiety lives in your body, what it feels like physically, rather than just cognitively. It means building a regulation practice, whether through breathwork, exercise, meditation, time in nature, or whatever form of physical regulation your nervous system responds to, that you can access when the alarm fires. It means building enough embodied experience of calming the alarm yourself without external reassurance that your nervous system gradually updates its model of what the alarm means. Not that the threat is real and action is required, but that this is a familiar response that you can move through. People who have done this work, who have developed genuine somatic regulation around attachment anxiety, respond differently to avoidant withdrawal, not because they're suppressing their feelings, not because they care less, but because they have a practice pathway back to regulation that doesn't run through the avoidant. They don't need to reach out to feel okay again. They can provide their own okayness. And that self-regulation, developed through actual practice rather than through willpower alone, is the neurological foundation of the genuine disengagement that produces the dynamic shift in the avoidant. Common mistakes that undo the dynamic. There are specific patterns that people fall into that derail the dynamic even when they've made real progress toward genuine disengagement. Recognizing them matters. The first and most common is the false ending. The person reaches a state of relative peace with the disengagement. The anxiety is quieted. The monitoring has decreased. Life has genuinely picked up momentum. And then the avoidant makes some small gesture of contact, a casual message, a brief interaction, something that could mean a great deal or very little depending on how it's read. And the anxiety system, which has been quieted but not resolved, fires back to full activation at the first available trigger. The response to that small gesture carries the accumulated weight of everything that was suppressed during the disengagement period, and the avoidant is immediately confronted again with the emotional intensity their system was specifically avoiding. This is the moment where the work becomes most visible. The person who has genuinely developed internal regulation, who has built actual somatic pathways back to calm and actual rootedness in their own life, can pause at that moment, take a breath, and respond from their grounded state rather than from the activated one. The person who has only performed disengagement has no actual regulatory resource to call on. Their calm was borrowed, not built. And so, the spike hits in full, and the response reflects it. Understanding which you are, at this moment, genuinely regulated or performing regulation, requires ruthless honesty, because the avoidance system will know the answer before you finish typing your response. The second mistake, closely related to the first, is premature interrogation of the reconnection. Even when the avoidant reaches back with genuine interest, the anxiously attached person's need to understand and secure the connection tends to push for explicit commitment or conversation about what happened before the avoidant is ready for it. Avoidants process slowly and often non-verbally. They need the reconnection to feel safe and low pressure before they're able to be articulate about it or explicit about their intentions. Pushing for a direct conversation about what happened, what it means, and what the other person's intentions are too early in the reconnection registers from the avoidance perspective as exactly the dynamic that caused the withdrawal in the first place. Emotional pressure for explicit commitment and verbal processing of feelings that they're not yet resourced to provide. The conversation may eventually be possible and may eventually be necessary, but timing is everything. And the timing is determined by the quality of safety the reconnection has built, not by the other person's need for reassurance. The third is losing your own ground. Someone who genuinely disengaged and rebuilt their life can, in the reconnection phase, quickly dissolve the life they built by immediately reorganizing everything around the avoidance renewed presence. The work that was done, the investment in independent projects, friendships, personal development, gets abandoned or minimized in favor of making the avoidant the center again. And the avoidant, sensing this, registers the shift from the person they were drawn back toward to a more familiar version of the dynamic they left. Maintaining your own ground through the reconnection, remaining invested in your independent life, even as the relationship resumes, is not a performance at that point. It's the ongoing expression of who you actually are, and it's what the reconnection requires in order to go somewhere different than it did before. The fourth mistake is applying the reconnection as proof of concept, rather than as a beginning. When the avoidant does come back, there's a tendency to treat it as confirmation that the strategy worked, and therefore to feel that the work is done. The life that was built during the disengagement phase gets treated as a means that has now reached its end. But the reconnection is not the destination. The reconnection is the beginning of whether the relationship can be different. And whether it can be different depends entirely on whether both people bring different patterns to it. The avoidant will bring their own evolved pattern or not. You need to bring yours, the pattern of being rooted in your own life, holding your own ground, communicating needs clearly and calmly, receiving care in the language the avoidant offers it. That pattern has to persist through the reconnection and beyond it. The moment you treat the reconnection as a victory that excuses a return to old behavior, the cycle begins again. When the avoidant comes back, navigating the return. If genuine disengagement works, if the avoidant does reach back, reinitiates, shows signs of renewed engagement, the quality of your response in the first stages of reconnection determines much of what follows. The avoidance system, which had been defending against closeness, doesn't suddenly relax completely when they choose to reinitiate. They're reaching back from a place of cautious curiosity at best, genuine care that has resurfaced at better, renewed investment in the connection at best of all. But the deactivating system doesn't get dismantled by a single decision to reach back. It's still there, still monitoring, still ready to re-engage if the environment begins to feel threatening again. This means that the person who receives the reconnection has a specific responsibility. Don't immediately recreate the conditions that produced the original withdrawal. The warmth of response matters. Genuine, relaxed warmth, glad to hear from you, good to reconnect, is the right register. The effusive warmth of someone flooded with relief. I've missed you so much. I've been hoping you'd reach out. I'm so glad things are back on track, is the wrong register. The first communicates, I have my own life and you're a welcome addition to it. The second communicates, I've been waiting and I'm going to need a lot from this reconnection. And the avoidance system reads that second register accurately and responds to it. Stay in your life. Continue what you are doing. Let the reconnection develop at a pace that allows the avoidant to regulate, to advance, and retreat as needed in the early stages, to gradually build the evidence they need that closeness in this relationship is different from the closeness that their system learned to manage defensively. This pace will feel slow to someone who has been waiting, but it is the pace that leads somewhere. There's a useful frame for thinking about the reconnection phase that can help with the management of pace and expectation. Think of the avoidance capacity for closeness as something that expands gradually with accumulated evidence of safety. Each instance of you responding to their renewed engagement with warmth but without urgency, with your own groundedness intact, with a quality of full presence that doesn't demand anything in return. Each instance deposits a small amount into the account of their nervous system's experience of this relationship as safe. The account doesn't fill quickly, but it fills steadily if the deposits are consistent and the account isn't periodically wiped out by moments of escalation or demand. What determines whether the deposits accumulate is the same thing that determined whether genuine disengagement was possible: the depth of your own self-possession. If you have it, if the work of the disengagement period actually built something real in you, then the reconnection will have a natural, sustainable quality to it. If the disengagement was performed and the self-possession was borrowed, the reconnection will eventually find the gap between the performance and the reality. The architecture always shows. There is also a version of the reconnection phase that's worth naming clearly because it's easy to misread. The avoidant who reaches back but hasn't done their own work. The one who returns because absence made the anxiety real but hasn't actually processed what they want or changed what they're able to offer. This person will cycle. They'll come close, feel the threat of closeness, withdraw, Feel the anxiety of absence come close again. Without their own work, the cycle repeats indefinitely. Engaging with this version of reconnection requires the clearest possible self-knowledge about what you actually need, what timeline you're actually working with, and what your genuine bottom line is for the relationship. Holding real standards and real limits, communicating them from calm, clear self-knowledge rather than from desperation, is what determines whether the reconnection goes somewhere or cycles back to nowhere. What this dynamic is actually pointing at step back from the avoidant for a moment. Look at the whole picture, the withdrawal, the suppressed attachment, the effect of genuine disengagement, the potential reconnection, and notice what it all converges on. Every piece of this points back to the same place. The avoidance behavior is the avoidance work. The suppression, the deactivating strategies, the withdrawal cycles, the eventual potential for reconnection, these belong to their process. You cannot engineer that process from outside. You cannot accelerate it through the right behavior or derail it through the wrong behavior in the ways that most people imagine. What you can do is stop being the stimulus that keeps their avoidance continuously activated. That is the entirety of your actual leverage in this dynamic. This is a genuinely difficult thing to accept for people who are deeply invested in the outcome because it feels passive. It feels like being told the only thing you can do is nothing. But that's a misread. Genuine disengagement is not nothing. It is among the most active and demanding things a person can do. It requires daily, ongoing choices about where to direct your energy, your attention, your investment. It requires developing real regulation skills. It requires confronting your own attachment wounds honestly and doing the work they require rather than using the avoidant dynamic as a way to avoid that confrontation. It is enormously active work. It's just all directed inward rather than outward. And that inward direction is precisely why it produces different results than everything that was directed outward, which means the most powerful move available to you and the most difficult one is to genuinely stop trying to influence their process and invest instead in your own, to build the life that would be worth living regardless of what they decide, to develop the internal resources that allow you to sit with uncertainty without being consumed by it, to become someone who doesn't need this particular connection to feel whole, which is the same kind of person who would be best positioned to maintain a healthy version of it if it becomes available. That's the irony this whole dynamic is built on. The work you do to genuinely move on and live your own life fully is simultaneously the work that creates the only real conditions for a healthy reconnection. Both outcomes, genuine independence from this connection and the possibility of a different kind of connection with this person, require exactly the same development. You cannot engineer one without achieving the other. And this means there is no version of this where the work is wasted. Either you get the reconnection you want on better terms with a better version of yourself, meeting a better version of them, or you get something more valuable, a life that doesn't depend on their participation to be full. The phrase, treat them like they're dead, points at the act of letting go of the outcome while staying fully invested in your own life. It points at the moment when your growth stops being contingent on theirs, when your wholeness stops being a question that any single person has the power to answer. That version of you, genuinely occupied, genuinely invested, genuinely self-directed, is both the most compelling thing an avoidant can encounter when they finally look up and the most worth becoming for your own sake, entirely independent of them. There's a final reframe worth offering here. Much of the discourse around avoidant psychology positions the person on the other side of the avoidant as a supplicant, someone trying to figure out the right combination of behaviors to unlock a particular response. That framing is limiting and ultimately disempowering because it places all of the agency on the avoidance side and all of the reactive waiting on your side. The genuine version of this dynamic doesn't work that way. The person who treats the avoidant as gone is not waiting for a response. They're not holding their breath. They're not secretly monitoring for signs of change. They've genuinely moved forward into a fuller version of their own life because that's what their own well-being requires, and because they've stopped organizing their growth around anyone else's timeline. The dynamic shift that sometimes follows, the avoidance awakening, the re-engagement, the possibility of something different, is a secondary effect of primary work. It's what can happen when you stop trying to produce it and start investing instead in something that doesn't depend on any single person's response. That reorientation, from waiting to building, from reactive to self-authored, is the work, not a step in the strategy, not a phase you get through to reach the goal, the work itself. The only version of this that actually works is the version that would be worth doing even if the avoidant never came back, because sometimes they don't come back, and the